So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 edition of Dubai Design Week panel discussion. Today, we'll be focusing on co-living in a COVID impacted world. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Bass Ackermann of Hive Coliv and Fadi Sarieddine, the architect working with Hive on their first project. Co-living is becoming an increasingly interesting market segment, one that is familiar in other parts of the world, but less so here in the UAE. Without further ado, please let me introduce the two panelists in today's discussion, Bass and Fadi. Perhaps, gentlemen, you can introduce yourselves briefly before we get into the main topic of today's discussion. So over to you, Bass.
Afternoon, Kerem. Delighted to be speaking to you and Fadi this afternoon. My name is Bass. I'm the founder of Hive Coliv. We, the UAE region's first developer solely focused on the development and management of co-living communities. I've been in the region for about 10 years, the last 3 years of which I've worked full-time on Hive and getting that off the ground. And we've got our first development at the moment coming up in JBC. So yes, delighted to be both of you.
Great. Thank you, Bass. Fadi, please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm glad to be participating in this talk. My name is Fadi Sarieddine. I'm the founder of Fadi Sarieddine Design Studio. We're based in D3 and we've been in Dubai for 16 years. This is a project that we're really proud to have been participated in because it's like a dream project in terms of the way we collaborated and workshopped this project with Bass especially. It's like one of the rare cases where a client allowed us a 3-month period of research, which is like really a dream project.
Thank you, Fadi. That's great. So, gentlemen, quick introduction to myself. My name is Kerem Cengiz. I'm the Managing Director of LWK MENA. We've been in the region a very short period of time, but very pleased to have been able to contribute to the design team here over the last few years. So moving on to the topic, I think it's really important that we set the scene. Obviously, this is a sort of a very interesting topic that I think will have more and more relevance. And I think the topic around a COVID impacted world is one that will have some significance on this particular sector of development. So Bass, perhaps you could give us a little bit of history of how Hive has started and what its ambitions are and what the aspirations are and where you think this might go.
Thanks, Kerem. I think Hive, if we take a macro view, I think over the last 4 or 5 years globally, we've really seen the emergence and proliferation of this notion of space as a service, really this paradigm shift away from inflexible, rigid, capital-intensive real estate and space, more towards something that's flexible, fully serviced, plug and play. I think we've seen that in the hospitality industry, we've seen it in the commercial industry with the likes of WeWork. And I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we've really seen that trend move into the residential space with the emergence of co-living. For us locally in Dubai, we started working on this model about 3 or 4 years ago. Our departure point was really the shortage that we saw in the housing market of really affordable, design-led quality accommodation for transient young professionals. This is a newer, younger generation, very much less focused on home ownership and really looking at housing as a service. So it's something that's flexible, it allows for mobility, it's convenient, and then obviously also affordable. And so 3 years ago, we started on this journey and we felt this is the right product for the market. Dubai traditionally has a very large transient young population, often their first or second job opportunity in Dubai. And so really we thought this model of providing fully serviced, flexible, mobile accommodation would work in this market.
That's fascinating. has this process been influenced by other movements internationally? Are there good precedents elsewhere?
Absolutely. I think both, not just in the residential space. I think if we look at what's happened with commercial space and the proliferation of co-working, I think that was really the trailblazer in terms of how real estate can be positioned away from the sort of product-oriented approach towards a more serviced approach. In the co-living space, there are multiple examples. I think at the moment, the UK, specifically London, areas like New York, San Francisco, this is where we're really starting to see bigger players emerge, purely focused on the development and management of co-living as a sort of new asset class, if you will.
On that note, Bass, as an asset class, I assume your own model in terms of how you monetize the product is also slightly different from the traditional model here in the UAE.
Good point. Absolutely. I think for us, we departed from the off-plan sales approach. I think here we see that's the approach predominantly followed by developers, and I think housing in that format tends to be sold off-plan, marketed and designed really for investors and sort of commoditized in a way. And with our product, with the concept of co-living, which is much more service-based, we felt that it's important that you not only develop these assets, but you have to take care of the ongoing management of these assets to really fulfill the vision. And so our approach is, in short, a build to rent approach. We retain ownership, and then we really take care of managing these communities to achieve our goals.
That's interesting. So your own model is a very participatory model where you look after the environment and you keep the environment positive, more than just on an FM basis, but actually in terms of setting the standards of behavior, setting the standards of environment that would be expected in that sort of living environment. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think what it comes down to for us really is this notion of community management. So you have facilities management, you have property management, and we're really looking at this additional service layer, which we call community management, which is really looking at how do we foster a better living experience. And that includes a more interactive, more collaborative type of environment where people can come together on their own terms and live in a way that's a bit more socially fulfilling, perhaps.
So in a way, more than just a rental contract, there'll be a social contract between Hive and its residents. So that's very interesting and very commendable. Perhaps we could just touch on the process that you went through in terms of beginning the design typology. Fadi, as the architect of the project, perhaps you can elaborate a little upon the design philosophy that you've developed with Bass and his team, and how that has eventuated into the first project, I believe, which is in JVC, which is very exciting. And you can maybe talk about the typology and what flex space you have in there in terms of the social interactivity.
For sure. Yeah, as I mentioned before, it was a really interesting process. It started with us visiting like precedent projects in London, and I myself with Bass, and I visited myself a few in Holland as part of the research to learn from like precedent projects. So it started with the research, and then that research led us into defining the direction of the architecture. And this was like, in a way, unusual to all the previous projects I've been working with. It's like the anti-icon, because always like people ask for a building to stand out and to be an icon. And this project, we felt like by definition, it should not be an icon. It should be a sober, understated building where the main focus would be on the inside of the building, like the users experience, their own space. It's like the psychology of the space itself and the way they actually, even the architecture, you can see it, how the user experience carved out, especially the public spaces, which is the main focus of the building.
Oh.
So that was the main direction where we said, okay, the building will have kind of tripartite division vertically, where the body of the building where the people live, and this is like where we concentrate more on the individual and his private space. And we went into like a more pure, very understated architecture where the grid influenced the design. And in contrast, in the ground floor, where actually the interaction will happen, where all these individuals become a community, we kind of did the process of mapping their daily life, be it inside the building or when they interact with the direct neighborhood. And these paths carved out in a very kind of organic way, the communal spaces. And you can see in the architecture, the kind of contrast between the body of the building and the communal spaces.
Just pondering for a moment and reverting back to the research part. I mean, obviously, as architects, we're trained to research and to sort of really analyze work. Can you maybe share a little bit of information about the case studies that you looked at in the UK and Holland?
Yes, for sure. I'm not sure if I can remember the names of all of them, because we covered around 20 cases. We visited, I think, around 10, but we researched another 10 without visiting them. And we analyzed the way they dealt with this relationship between the communal space and the individual space. And we found we definitely learned a lot, because we found some good examples where we also learned from, and we learned more from the bad examples where obviously this model works on, because the developer has to invest in the communal space, which is a good investment. So that will mean that the individual space will be more efficient and to the point. And some people went too far into making it too small, where it's to the point of claustrophobia. So we stayed in one of these two claustrophobic rooms, and we said this is definitely not what we're doing. The challenge was to design a very efficiently, area-wise, efficient room, but while the challenge was to make it in meter square, as per brief, but the way we design it feel bigger. And all of studio and one bedroom, and even the two bedroom, they're all designed in a way where we exploded the space without adding area, just the way it's laid out. And I hopefully we succeeded in that.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I mean, it sounds like in terms of the residential component, it's quite a cellular approach with the focus and the value add being around the common areas that are shared. Exactly. With those examples, Bass, were some of those developers that Fadi was referring to in the UK and Holland, were they sort of socially orientated developers, or were they largely private developers? Because I get a very sort of strong sense of a social component within this sort of, whilst it's obviously a private development, the social aspect is particularly important. And I mean that in the context of the broadest context of the word social. So I would imagine, I mean, the UK and Holland in particular have a very strong social housing agenda in terms of how that contributes back, and actually is a very strong development stream, particularly in the UK, and I know in Holland and in other Scandinavian countries. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit, Bass.
I think when Fadi and I did the research, what we saw in the co-living space per se, there are only a handful of operators, or there were only a handful about 3 years ago. In the UK, there's 2 or 3 big players, same in the Netherlands. In the UK, what we saw was that it was a more commercially orientated approach that they took. It was a much more institutional type of product that they developed. I think from a regulatory point of view, they do have small components within each of these developments that is classified as affordable housing. But I think from a philosophical point of view, from a business model point of view, they're much more institutional and financially orientated or driven. I think in America and elsewhere in Europe, you've seen a number of smaller players emerge who are doing smaller scale developments, but much more socially focused, with a real focus on the community, the well-being, and really following less of a top-down approach and really saying, how can we bring people together and just facilitate them living together in a way that's more sustainable in sharing resources, and that's also more fulfilling in how they live together.
Thank you. I think that's a very good answer, and it's like I think maybe we can come back to this a bit later on when we touch upon some of the slightly more esoteric issues around co-living, particularly within the framework of the UAE. I think it would be in the context of this year's design week, the impact of the post-COVID world and the impact of COVID on our lives right now, which is so immediately and ever present, is something that I'd like to sort of just dwell on for a short time. Obviously, the sense of co-living, I feel a very harmonious approach to life, and and particularly for the generation that you're targeting, the Gen Y to Gen Zs, who are much more interactive with each other and yet at the same time distant. So the model sort of sits very interestingly inside that. But obviously COVID is now placing a series of demands and restrictions upon us. Perhaps you can just, philosophically wonder out loud how you feel that might impact on your current project that's under construction, and how it may evolve your thinking around the model going forward, or whether or not you believe, I mean, this is maybe slightly contentious of me, we are in a COVID environment now, it won't be with us forever. And is it really the fact that past COVID will return to a normal rather than a post-COVID normal? And that the post-COVID element is more around the edges that, as we are doing now, meeting online rather than face-to-face.
I think if I start with the second part of your question, looking a bit broader, longer term, I think for me, co-living, in a sense, is just a form of shared accommodation, high density accommodation. From an economic point of view, I don't think high density urban accommodation will disappear. I think it's just not an economic reality. And I think if we look 5-10 years out, it's really for us as industry professionals, developers, designers, to say, well, high density urban accommodation is not going anywhere. How do we tackle the increasing sort of consumer consciousness as to well-being, health and safety in the way that we design, operate and manage these type of assets? To come a bit closer to home, I think for us, we obviously designed the building, the project that we have in JVC pre-COVID, but moving forward, I think the co-living model can be tailored and can adapt to a post-COVID world, and we can delve into that shortly from a design point of view. But I think the other point that I just want to make on that is I think also the more important part of that also comes down to user behavior and how consumers adapt to this notion. I think us as industry professionals can take the design so far, and then after that, it really is up to how we as consumers and individuals behave and interact.
Interesting you say that user behavior is obviously one that's very difficult to legislate. In your model, as a large component of it will be a communal facility, bookable spaces, I'm assuming. Will you have a concierge elements as part of the facility in terms of how residents will book spaces, use spaces for solitary activity or group activities?
Yes, yes, to answer your question in short. And I think from our point of view, the way we manage these buildings, even pre-COVID, our focus was very much on improving the convenience and the level of service that you find in these type of developments. And that did boil down to essentially having a community management function permanently employed on site, and that being a person or persons who really are responsible to facilitate a better living experience for residents, everything from concierge service to facilitating community interaction, helping people on a day-to-day basis with whatever it might be. I think in a post-COVID world, it's really for us to look at, with our first project, how do we adapt operationally to facilitate a sort of healthier and safer environment for people. And that comes down to silly little things like reducing the number of touch points that a resident might experience when they arrive in the basement parking and moving through the building up until such time as they reach their apartment. So it's those small little details or levels of refinement that we're looking at now within our current development. And then I think moving forward, longer term, and this is something we can delve into with Fadi, I think there are obviously broader design solutions that we can look at pursuing and implementing.
And Fadi, from your perspective, I'd sort of like to move on to the design implications of that sort of post-COVID environment. As an architect, how do you feel you can address this, or do you feel there's a necessity to address it in any specific way? I mean, I have to agree with Bass. I think you know, the model of urban densification necessarily needs to continue to prevent urban sprawl. We know that there are cities in the world that are much denser than Dubai, that are having a lot less impact of COVID in terms of social distancing with less cases. So I think the density argument isn't necessarily an argument that leads to more cases of issues around COVID. I think it's very much a behavioural issue and how society chooses to engage with that. As an architect and as an urbanist, how do you feel that the design process that we undertake can assist in supporting the combating of these sort of situations? And how do you feel that the design you have now and one that you may evolve in the future would evolve to respond to any potential issues going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we've heard cases in Dubai where people moved out of their apartment into villas. They could afford it, obviously, but because they didn't want to feel trapped in their apartment. But I mean, I think the target clientele for Hive is not people that could afford villas. It is targeting kind of young professionals and who kind of tend to do co-living anyway, but in a makeshift situation. What Hive is offering is like a fully resolved co-living solution. So I think from my point of view, as an architect and as let's say I'm a potential tenant in Hive, if I want to be in an apartment, I'd rather be in a co-living building rather than a normal classical apartment building. Why? Because an apartment building will offer me nothing in the case of a lockdown. A co-living building, in contrast, can it has to be obviously supported by operationally, how it will work, how you can, let's say in extreme cases of a lockdown where the whole building can be locked down, all the people can be kind of deemed safe to interact with each other, but they can be a really self-sufficient community that safely interacts. So I'd rather be in such a building where I'm not confined completely to my apartment. I can go down safely, use the communal spaces, go to the kind of backyard, which is also isolated from being kind of spatially penetrated. And obviously, yes, definitely it's a better solution in a case of extreme lockdown. And even in cases which the case now that we're living now, which is post-lockdown, and we're still having certain procedures that we're doing, like the Zoom meeting we're doing now, working from home again. So obviously there will be some maybe minor adjustments to the design as in parallel to the minor adjustments to the operations. But if I'm also working from home, in situations we've seen examples where companies are thinking of permanently shrinking their offices and continue working from home for, let's say, 50%, or create kind of shifts in the day or in the week. So yeah, again, if I'm working from home, I'd rather be in a co-living building where I can go down, interact. There's printing facilities, there's meeting rooms, there's outdoor lounges where I can work on my laptop without feeling restrained in the room. And if I'm in the room, also, again, because we mentioned the way we designed the room, and I mean, working from home is not only co-living, it's been happening anyway before COVID started. So we designed the rooms in a way that they can like maybe host somebody who's having like entrepreneur and he's starting a small business, like an e-commerce business, and he's working from home actually. And so we designed the rooms and the studios in a way where you have a desk that can fold out because your studio is small. You don't want the desk always in your, like in the space, occupying space. So we designed certain areas where they can fold out the desk, work on it comfortably with a view. And then when you're not working, you can fold it away.
Great.
So I think, yeah, the answer is that we're kind of ready without, unconsciously, we were ready for it.
I think that's a very good response, and I tend to agree with you. I'd like to sort of slightly depart from some of the design and COVID issues and refocus back onto the precept or the concept of co-living. We understand the practicalities of it, we understand the advantages of it, but we also understand that the legislative framework that exists in the UAE could also be a bit challenging. Bass, how do you see this? What are you doing to mitigate some of the challenges in terms of legislation to ensure that a model like this is continues to be successful? Because I really believe that there's a real place for this, particularly in a city like Dubai.
It's interesting. I think the way we tackled this when we set out about 3 years ago is our departure point was really to look at how do we adapt this phenomenon to Dubai? For us, we said in Dubai, we felt that there was a lack of affordable accommodation, serviced accommodations for young professionals. And so we looked internationally how has this been dealt with elsewhere, not just from a regulatory point of view, but from a design, from a conceptual point of view. And I think one of the key things that we said at that point in time was when you look at co-living, it's really this balance between private space and communal space. That's what it comes down to. And from a fundamental point of view, if you shrink the private space, you can make it more affordable for people, and then you can give back in the sense of communal amenities where people can break out and socialize. What we said at that point in time, first and foremost, in the greater context of Dubai, being a low density city where people are traditionally used to living in bigger apartments and types of accommodation, we didn't want to go down the route of having people living together and sharing bedrooms in small apartments. So from the start, we said our model is more focused on private single occupancy apartments, and where need be shared apartments, but with single occupancy bedrooms. That was our focus initially. And from there, we then started looking at how does that fit in with the local regulatory framework. I think fundamentally what we've ended up with really is private single occupancy apartments with a small percentage of shared apartments and accommodation. But I think really what that's allowed us to do is deliver a living solution that's affordable. And that really we achieved by optimizing purely the efficiency of the apartment. So we said, if you look at a traditional studio or a one-bedroom apartment, a young professional doesn't need a big U-shaped kitchen or guest bathroom or any of these type of facilities, but they end up paying for it indirectly. And so by really getting rid of these redundant components, we ended up with studios and one-bedroom apartments that's still a decent size, very efficiently designed, very functional and adaptable in the way that it's been designed and furnished. And then on top of that, we've got this communal amenity space, which really is there for the residents to enjoy. The point there being that you can comfortably live and work within your own private space and sphere, and choose as and when you wish to socialize with people on your own terms in the communal amenities.
I think that's very interesting, and I think it's very encouraging, because I think if we look at a model like co-living, and within a legislative framework, it allows for control, and it allows for safety, and also it allows for redress, because we know that, you know, whether it's official or unofficial, there are all sorts of ad hoc co-living models here in the UAE. Some work for those people who can afford to have a better environment, and for those who are less advantaged, there are a lot less safe options. So I think that what you're doing, whilst it's a private investment model, has very broad implications and deeper and longer term implications to maybe the socially less advantaged across the UAE. So that's to be commended. Gentlemen, I'm conscious that our time is running out. I'd like to sort of end on a slight divergence from this, but also a similar parallel. Your model talks to me in different sectors, not just in terms of the young and the transient, maybe the first time moving away from home and family, even though their family may be in the UAE. But I can see potentially this model challenging the traditional hospitality sort of service apartment formats as well. Is that something that you considered looking into, and how you may unpack the model into different sectors?
Absolutely. I think different sectors and also different age groups. I think in terms of different sectors, for us, we really see this paradigm shift away from products and more towards services. This idea of housing as a service, which I touched on already. I think service apartments achieve that successfully for a very small segment of the population, and predominantly geared towards short-term stays, business travelers, really a landing pad for people arriving in a new city and needing accommodation for a week or two. I think the space that we are playing in is really geared towards more of a long-term stay type product. So we are saying, sort of from a consumer preference point of view, people really desire to live in a more convenient, more service-orientated living solution on a longer term basis. And that's, I think, where we come in and where we deviate from your traditional serviced hotel apartments per se. Just the last point on that, I think also talking about different age groups, I think this is a very interesting model also when you start looking at elderly living and retirement villages, and how this type of concept could proliferate and be adapted for different demographics.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, and I think it's probably a sector that's going to be increasingly growing and has not had very much attention so far. So that's very exciting to hear. Bass, thank you for sharing that. Fadi, on a last note, how do you feel that our urban environment, as an urbanist, how do you feel our urban environment is going to evolve to respond to this type of format, but also a post-COVID environment? Do you feel that there is going to be a paradigm shift, or do you feel that things will become back to a normal position, and yet these new models will begin to actually fill the gaps that exist between our communities, which we suffer greatly here in the UAE?
Yes, I think as humans, we're always like we resist change. So we're kind of trying to get back to our habits. I've seen it in the COVID time, people want to get back to their habits. I've read during the extreme COVID time, I've read an interesting article by Arundhati Roy. She's an Indian author, and she's actually calling in the article all human, all the world, to kind of use this as a gateway towards a new world where we don't carry our heavy baggage with us. I think this call is not gonna, the human society will not respond to that because we resist change. But in terms of from an urban point of view, I think what Bass and Hive have done is something, I wonder why it took so long for this to happen, because there was a market gap in that. A lot of young professionals moved to Dubai and they suffer, they have to pay one check and all of this. And this solution was kind of dormant. I mean, I say, I wonder how, why it took so long to happen. In Dubai in general, the solutions in terms of co-living, yes, they will create a change, and they will be, I think it will trickle down to other developers. They start doing it. What I also want to say, in terms of urban context, also this solution also not only provides a co-living, but activating the ground floor itself is something that Dubai lacks. And we were conscious of it when we were designing Hive, especially like in JVC, you can make a model where you can build the parking on the first 2 floors and then push the ground floor, in a way, the active ground floor to kind of above the parking. But we resisted that because we felt that Dubai lacks that from an urban point of view. You walk on the street and you're like not interacting with the building. You're always like having a parking, a substation. So that's what was very important for us, especially that in JVC, the problem persists. And I also want to say that we designed the building not only for JVC. Like this was very important because we knew from the beginning that Hive is going to roll out into different. So there was a kind of restraint on how to design a building for its context, but also for a broader context. So yeah.
Thank you, Fadi. I think you begin to open up a whole other area of discussion here, which I feel very passionate about, which is the engagement of the public realm. Yeah. I think we can have another conversation here, hopefully very soon, inshallah. Bass, I'd like the final word to be with you. Perhaps you can give us an overview of the future for you guys at Hive, your aspirations, and where you want to take this co-living model.
Apologies. I think for us as Hive, this is something we're very passionate about. This is something we really believe in. We want to grow this concept and introduce it to the broader region. Really look at how do we foster this, how do we grow this out in a very sustainable manner. We don't want to scale overnight. We're conscious of that. But next step for us really is to build out our pipeline in Dubai. So we have another 2 projects in the development pipeline. And then we're looking at the broader region and how this concept can be adapted for elsewhere in the region. And Saudi comes to mind in that. So that's what the future holds for us. And I think for us, fundamentally, we're just excited to really design and build a product that's specifically been tailored for a dedicated segment of the population to give them a better living experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bass. That's great. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. I'd like to thank Bass Ackermann and Fadi Sarieddine for their huge contribution in today's conversation for the 2020 Dubai Design Week panel discussions. I think this is a topic that has a lot of discussion still to continue, and I look forward to seeing you both leading the charge in that. So thank you both, and congratulations on the work so far.